I welcome you to the reflection of the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year A. And the theme of our reflection this week is the divine invitation, an opportunity to feast with God. It is a banquet. Are you always ready to accepting this invitation, or you are always giving an excuse to accomplishing a task before this banquet? Anyway, join me, let us take a walk through the readings and to see the joy of this banquet. In the first reading from the book of Prophet Isaiah chapter 25, we see Isaiah in addressing the people of Israel during their last years of Babylonian exile described a banquet that everyone would want to attend. It is a prophecy of blessing of the Messiah kingdom, the Mount Zion, the New Jerusalem, that is open to both Jews and Gentiles. Now, participation in this banquet gives one the opportunity of enjoying three benefits: the destruction of death, the wiping away of tears from every face, and then that God's hand was to be on this Mount Zion. Now, it is customary for kings to demonstrate their kingly power by a heroic act. And so, this was exemplary in the birthday of Herod, where Herodias' daughter Salome demanded the head of John the Baptist, and so the king obliged her. But then Isaiah describes God's own heroic act as the wiping of tears from the face of everyone, the destruction of death, and the bringing to an end the cursed concept in Isaiah 24 verse 4. And so now in the second reading, St. Paul he expresses an attitude of contentment that is deeply rooted in God. For he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He didn't show an attitude of dependency in human might. Rather, he considers this attitude of contentment as a gift from God. And so he urges us to have Christ always. For when we have Christ, we can always cope with every situation. In the gospel reading of today, Christ describes this, he gives us the picture of the kingdom and the church in the parable of the wedding feast. For it is customary Jewish time that when the invitation to a feast like the wedding feast was given, then a time was not stated. And so when the wedding feast preparation to this banquet was ready, servants are sent to summon guests to invite guests to this banquet. And so in the parable of the wedding feast, this was the situation when the king, after getting everything ready, sent servants to invite guests into this banquet. But then, in this situation, the guests who were invited insultingly refused this invitation. But Christ didn't stop, the king didn't stop at this. He went further to sending more messengers to inviting other guests. Dear friends, there are a lot of lessons we need to learn from the parable, from the readings of today. Now, Christ remains the king who summons you and I to this banquet. He is the groom, and the church remains the bride. Christ is wedded to the church. And so each day, every day, he invites us to this banquet through the Holy Eucharist. And then participation and as receiving Christ in this banquet renews us in grace and love. And so, dear friends, we receive our first invitation in baptism. And so since then, Christ has not stopped inviting us into this banquet. By his death and resurrection, he has encoded our names into this list of invited guests. Now it is now left for us, like the guest in the parable of the wedding feast, to accept this invitation or to reject this invitation. And so the guests rejected this invitation by going their own way and doing their own business. Are you also dare to refuse this invitation? Remember that this invitation is an invitation to a joyous feast, a feast we can't afford to miss. Why? Because it is an invitation of grace. Because in the parable of the wedding feast, the guests who were invited refused this invitation, but Christ went out, sent more messengers to invite everyone. So you and I are privileged Christians. This invitation is an invitation of grace that we can't afford to miss. But then remember that those who refused and rejected this invitation were finally burnt, and their city burnt also were destroyed. So now we can't afford to be destroyed and our own city destroyed. So we need to accept this invitation such that when we receive this invitation, we become renewed in grace and love. For St. Paul says, when we receive Christ, when we have Christ, we can cope with every situation and we can do anything in Christ, through Christ, who strengthens us. May the good Lord continue to bless His words in our hearts, so that we do the will of God in this new week, that we may accept this invitation always and enjoy these benefits of the people, of the invited guests. May the good Lord bless His